The morning light was barely breaking through the blinds when my phone lit up with a flood of missed calls, each one carrying the same frantic energy I'd come to recognize too well. My heart tightened before I even pressed the screen, sensing the storm waiting on the other side. It's strange how silence can feel louder than any argument, especially when it's your own family demanding answers you no longer owe them. If you're listening right now, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from, because feeling unseen in your own home is more common than people admit. As the notifications kept pouring in, I realized this wasn't concern at all. It was panic. Panic that I was finally choosing myself, and that was the moment everything started to shift. Let me show you how it all began. I never expected my birthday to start with a reminder of how invisible I had become. When my daughter brushed off my plans so she could focus on a teenager's party, I felt that familiar sting spread across my chest, a quiet ache I'd learned to carry without protest. For years, I had let moments like that pass, telling myself it wasn't worth causing tension, but this time felt different, almost surreal, because none of them knew what I was holding inside. Just 48 hours earlier, I had inherited $82,000. I kept that truth tucked so deeply inside me that it felt almost unreal, like I was walking around Richmond with a second heartbeat no one could hear. As I stood in my kitchen that morning, sunlight slipping through the blinds, I realized how strange it was to still feel so small when my entire life had just shifted. It wasn't the money itself, it was what it represented. For the first time in decades, I had the power to decide what my life could look like, yet my family still treated me like an afterthought they could schedule around. I thought about all the years I had let myself fade into the background, hoping kindness would be enough to earn consideration. Instead, I was left waiting for scraps of attention, pretending it didn't hurt. But as I sat there, letting the weight of the moment settle, something in me shifted. The betrayal still burned, but beneath it, something else flickered, something steady, unfamiliar, and quietly bold. And that feeling carried me back to where this all began, to the moment everything changed. I can still feel the way my stomach dropped 2 days earlier when the call came in from a law office downtown. I almost didn't pick up, assuming it was another reminder about a bill I was juggling or some appointment I had forgotten. Life had felt like that for so long, just keeping myself stitched together, moving quietly through Richmond like someone no one really noticed. But when I heard the name of my aunt, Caroline, something inside me froze. She had always been distant, more of a gentle mystery than a presence in my life. I remembered summers where she would send a postcard instead of visiting, each one written in that looping handwriting that felt both warm and unreachable. I never imagined she held me in any special place in her heart. When I sat in that office, listening to the attorney explain her wishes, I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. It didn't make sense that a woman who barely spoke to anyone had left me everything: her home, her investments, and $82,000. I kept waiting for someone to correct themselves, to say a name that wasn't mine. Then they handed me her letter. It was simple, folded neatly, and heavier than it should have been. Reading her words felt like stepping into a room I didn't know existed, one where someone had seen my struggles, my loneliness, my quiet endurance. She wrote about wanting me to finally live a life that belonged to me, not one built around everyone else's needs. Walking out of that office, Richmond felt different. My life, my choices, my future. They no longer felt like distant things I had to negotiate for. For the first time, I felt a small spark inside me, delicate but alive. And that spark is what carried me into the next chapter, where everything began to change. I woke up the morning after that meeting with a different kind of stillness inside me. It wasn't fear or dread, the feelings I'd grown used to carrying. It was possibility, strange, fragile, but unmistakably there. For once, I didn't rush into anyone else's needs. I sat with myself, letting the reality of what I'd been given settle into my bones. And then, almost without thinking, I made the first choice that belonged entirely to me. I booked an appointment at a salon I had walked past for years, always telling myself it wasn't for women like me. When I stepped inside, the faint smell of hair products and warm towels wrapped around me, and I felt a tremor of something I hadn't felt in decades, the sense of being worth someone's attention. As they worked on my hair, shaping and softening and making me look like someone I barely recognized, I realized I had been moving through life half asleep. Seeing myself in the mirror afterward felt like waking up. That same afternoon, I reserved a table at an upscale restaurant in Richmond for my birthday dinner. Not because someone insisted, not because it fit anyone else's schedule, but because I wanted a night that honored the woman I had tried so hard to be, even when no one seemed to notice. Planning it felt like stringing together pieces of my identity I had long forgotten. As I confirmed the reservation, a quiet thrill moved through me. I knew my family wouldn't understand this shift. Not yet. I could almost sense the storm gathering in the distance, their confusion, their questions, their need to pull me back into the role I had always played. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of that storm. I was ready to step into it, and that confidence carried me into the night of the celebration itself. Walking into the restaurant that evening felt like stepping into a version of my life I had only ever imagined from a distance. Soft lighting spilled across the polished floors, and the quiet hum of conversation filled the space with a warmth I could feel in my chest. For once, I wasn't rushing in behind anyone or waiting for permission to belong. I was there because I had chosen to celebrate myself, and that simple truth felt almost overwhelming. The hostess greeted me with a kindness that caught me off guard, guiding me to a beautifully set table near the window. I remember pausing for a moment, taking in the glow of the candles and the city lights flickering against the glass. It was such a small thing, but it felt like a quiet acknowledgement of my own worth, something I hadn't given myself in far too long. My friends arrived one by one, each offering genuine smiles and warm embraces. They didn't need anything from me. They were just glad to be there. The conversation flowed easily, weaving between laughter, old memories, and gentle encouragement. With every passing minute, I felt layers of old heaviness slipping away. The food was exquisite, rich flavors, thoughtful details, the kind of meal people savor rather than simply eat, but it was the photographer the restaurant provided that made the night feel truly transformative. When she asked if I wanted a few portraits, I almost said no out of habit. Instead, I let her capture me as I was in that moment, lighter, hopeful, quietly proud. When I saw the photos later, I barely recognized the woman smiling back. She looked alive. I decided to share a few of those pictures online, thinking nothing of it. It felt like a simple act of honoring the night. But I had no idea how quickly those images would ripple through my family, or how fast everything would shift once they saw the woman I was becoming. The photos had barely been online an hour when my phone started vibrating non-stop. At first, I thought something terrible had happened, but the longer I watched the calls stack up, from Alyssa, from Mark, from Tyler, the clearer it became that the emergency was me, or rather, the version of me they couldn't recognize. A woman dressed beautifully, smiling confidently, celebrating herself without their permission. It was almost unsettling how quickly concern twisted into panic. By noon, The messages had piled into long threads of questions, assumptions, and thinly veiled demands. They wanted to know where I had been, who I had been with, why I was acting different. The tone had that familiar edge, the one that implied I owed them an explanation for living my own life. I didn't respond. For once, I let the silence sit. Later that afternoon, they showed up at my front door without warning. The way they hovered in the entryway, glancing around as if expecting to find evidence of something, told me everything I needed to know. Their words were careful, but the suspicion underneath was loud. They weren't worried about me. They were worried about losing whatever version of me they had depended on, financially, emotionally, practically, for far too long. As they circled around their questions, I felt something shift inside me. It was like a veil lifting, showing me the years of small expectations, constant taking, and the unspoken belief that my life revolved around making theirs easier. I saw it clearly for the first time, and the clarity hurt, but it also steadied me. When they started pushing about my spending, about whether I was being responsible, that was the moment the second turning point snapped into place. I felt my back straighten, my voice steadied. I didn't lash out. I simply stopped shrinking. I told them, calmly, that my life was my own, and I meant it in a way I never had before. Their stunned silence said more than any argument could, and as they left, unsettled and off balance, I knew the real reckoning was coming, the moment when I would finally close the door on the bank of Mom once and for all. The meeting happened the next evening, and it felt less like a conversation and more like a coordinated attempt to steer me back into my old role. Alyssa sat forward with that familiar edge of urgency. Mark hovered with quiet expectation, and Tyler carried an air of strategy, as if he were preparing to negotiate terms. They started with pleasantries, but it didn't take long before the real reason surfaced. They needed help. Again. There were debts piling up, refinancing costs they couldn't handle, and tuition support they assumed I would contribute to without question. As I listened, a part of me drifted through years of memories. I remembered the checks I wrote to keep Alyssa afloat after one impulsive decision after another. I remembered the countless times I helped Mark with rent, car repairs, or last-minute expenses. I remembered the holidays where I drained my savings to make sure their families had what they wanted, even when I had so little left for myself. And woven through it all was the quiet expectation that I would always be there, always ready to bridge the gap, always willing to sacrifice, sitting there, hearing them list off what they needed next. Something inside me settled with a final, steady clarity. It wasn't anger. It wasn't bitterness. It was the understanding that I had trained them to rely on me this way, and that if I didn't change, nothing else would either. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm. I told them I wasn't taking on their debts. I wasn't paying for refinancing. I wasn't covering tuition. I explained, with a clarity they weren't prepared for, that the Bank of Mom was closed, permanently. Their stunned faces reminded me of children realizing a door they always walked through had been locked. The room fell silent, heavy with disbelief and shifting dynamics. Yet beneath that tension, I sensed the faintest ripple of something new on the horizon, an unexpected ally waiting just beyond this moment, ready to change the path ahead. I had barely caught my breath from the confrontation when I heard a soft knock at my door. I almost didn't answer, worried the storm had returned. But when I opened it, I saw Emma standing there. No attitude, no demands, just this gentle uncertainty in her eyes. She looked younger than her 16 years in that moment, like she wasn't sure if she even had the right to be there. Something in me softened instantly. She stepped inside quietly, and the house felt different with her in it, calmer, lighter, almost safe. She told me she had heard the tension earlier, that the adults were arguing in circles again, and she didn't understand why they were treating me like I had done something wrong. Hearing that from her was like having someone place a warm hand on a bruise I hadn't realized was still tender. Emma has always been observant, but this time she saw everything with a clarity her parents refused to acknowledge. She said she noticed how they talked over me, how they expected me to fix everything, and how none of them ever seemed to wonder what I might want. Her words weren't meant to soothe me. They were simply the truth, spoken without fear. For the first time in a long while, I found myself opening up, not fully, but enough to share that I was learning to value myself again. I didn't give details about money or conflict. I just told her I needed to make choices that made me feel whole. She listened the way adults rarely do, with no agenda, no judgment, just genuine care. Before she left, she asked if we could spend more time together. That small request touched something deep inside me. It felt like a bridge forming where a wall had been for years. As she walked out, I felt a quiet hope taking root, guiding me toward the next step in rebuilding my life. Life felt strangely quiet in the days after everything came crashing into the open. It wasn't an empty quiet. It was the kind that lets you finally hear yourself again. Once the dust settled, I realized how much space I suddenly had to make decisions for myself, without bracing for someone else's reaction. That alone felt like the beginning of a new life. My first step was handling the practical side of my inheritance. I met with a trusted advisor recommended by the law office, someone who walked me through every detail with patience and clarity. Sitting in that office, reviewing accounts, property documents, and investment outlines, I felt a sense of responsibility rather than fear. For once, my future wasn't a question mark filled with worry. It was something I could shape intentionally. Back home, I made small but meaningful changes. I repainted my living room in a soft cream tone that made the space feel brighter. I bought new linens, ones that felt luxurious against my skin. I even scheduled a full health checkup, something I had put off for years because there was always someone else who needed time, money, or attention more than I did. Tending to myself felt foreign at first, but it grew easier with each step. I started exploring things I had quietly dreamed about: gardening, a beginner's watercolor class, long morning walks without rushing anywhere. Each choice, no matter how simple, felt symbolic. Little by little, I was building a life that reflected who I was becoming, not the woman who had been trapped in routine obligation. There was relief in the air around me now, a sense of possibility opening like a window I hadn't cracked in decades. And as I settled into this new rhythm, I could feel the next shift approaching. The moment when my family would finally realize I wasn't going back to the way things had been. The weeks that followed brought a shift I could feel long before I could name it. Alyssa grew distant first. She stopped calling altogether, except for the occasional message that hovered somewhere between polite and cold. I could sense she was waiting for me to break the silence, to slip back into old habits and offer help she no longer asked for directly. But I didn't. I answered kindly, briefly, and kept my boundaries in place. That alone seemed to unsettle her. Mark followed a similar pattern, though his approach was quieter. He would reach out with small comments, almost as if testing the edges of the new reality. He wanted to see if I would offer money without being asked, as I had so many times before. When I didn't, there was a pause, a long one, but not as sharp as Alyssa's withdrawal. His messages became shorter, then sporadic. I felt the distance, but I didn't chase it. Not this time. Through all of this, Emma remained steady. She stopped by after school when she could, sometimes just to sit with me while I made dinner or talked about her classes. Her presence became a grounding force, a reminder that change doesn't always break things. Sometimes it simply rearranges them. She saw me as a person, not a resource, and that alone brought more peace than I expected. As I watched the family find their own rhythms without leaning on me, I felt a quiet acceptance settle in. Some relationships might heal, some might not. And for the first time, I understood that both outcomes were all right. I had stepped into a new chapter, and they were adjusting in their own ways. Standing in that calm space, I knew I was ready to share the lesson this journey had carved into me, a message for anyone who's ever felt unseen. Looking back on everything, I'm struck by how quietly a life can drift off course. For years, I told myself I was being a good mother by giving until it hurt, by staying small so others could take up more space. I didn't realize how deeply I had begun to disappear in my own family. It took an unexpected inheritance, a birthday spent honoring myself, and a reckoning I never planned for to finally see the truth. My worth was never tied to what I could give away. It was tied to who I am. Setting boundaries didn't magically fix everything. Alyssa still keeps her distance. Mark is finding his own way. There are moments when the silence feels heavy, and I wonder if things will ever feel simple again. But simplicity was never the goal. Self-respect was. And reclaiming that has changed the entire rhythm of my life. I've learned that you can love your family and still say no. You can show up for people without losing yourself in the process. And you can start over at any age, even after decades of feeling unseen. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is step back into your own life and refuse to shrink again. If you've ever felt invisible, overlooked, or taken for granted, please know you're not alone. Your worth isn't determined by who depends on you. It's determined by who you allow yourself to become. Thank you for listening to my story. Have you ever faced something like this? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one.